Running backs, and sometimes even quarterbacks, are generally the first positions taken off the board in fantasy football drafts. So are the wide receivers really that valuable then? In this video, I will discuss why the wide receiver position is actually the most underrated position in fantasy football, and why it is extremely important that you lock up elite wide receivers on your team. What's up, everybody? We're back with another episode of Fantasy Football 201, an advice show on my channel to help you in fantasy football. Today's video, we will be talking about wide receiver strategy. So if you're interested in more videos like this, please check out my channel. I have strategy videos of every single position to help you leading up to the fantasy football draft. I also do mock drafts. I also have team previews as well in fantasy football content. So if you're interested, please check out more of that in the description below. And I also make some other content too on my channel. So if you're interested in a wide variety of stuff, please consider checking out this channel. So we will talk today about the wide receiver position. And the biggest takeaway that I want to make in this video for wide receivers is that they are one of the most underrated positions in terms of the value that they provide to a fantasy football team. And I will break this down both statistically and conceptually in terms of how underrated wide receivers are. But it's very important to get a good wide receiver on your team early in the draft, in my opinion, because you want to take away some of the potential issues that come up where you do not have a consistent wide receiver to rely upon. If you have great wide receivers, it really alleviates a lot of potential issues for you as this season progresses. So the first thing that I want to say with regards to wide receivers being underrated, basically the way it goes in drafts is that a lot of people prioritize getting running backs first because of the fact that in a lot of people's minds, running backs are scarce, and you have to make sure you get good RBs early because some running backs do not dominate as much as other running backs. And there is a lot of valid argument to be made for that, and that is very consistent advice to take running backs early. However, there's some other flaws to that plan to consider. So first of all, the two key takeaways that I want to say with regards to arguing for wide receivers being valuable is that if you think about it, in a particular game for an offense, you have one running back that you're consistently giving the ball to for the most part. Sometimes you platoon, but in general, it's one running back that's getting the ball. So for 32 teams in the league, there's going to be opportunities for all of those individual running backs to dominate the game from time to time. That's generally how an offense is constructed, that you'll have one central running back who gets the majority of the carries. So you actually can find some very valuable running backs late. The key is you just have to really constantly monitoring the waiver wire and get those guys in advance when they're get some handcuffs, guys that get injured, and then those handcuffs will fill into positions. If you want more specifics on that, check out my RB video in the description below. But for wide receivers, the way an NFL offense is constructed is that you generally have three wide receivers that are involved from time to time on plays. And then you also include a tight end as well. So when the quarterback drops back to pass, they're splitting those options between 3 to 4 different players, as opposed, sometimes even 5 if they run a 4 receiver set, as opposed to a rushing play where they're just giving it off to generally the same player. So that means that for the wide receiver position, there are less receivers that typically dominate games on specific teams because their offense is generally sharing the ball more. However, there are a few receivers that do get the majority of the targets, and those are the ones that you want to especially have. I will get into more specifics on this in a sec, but that's just a very conceptual idea to think about in terms of wide receivers. The other argument to make in terms of wide receivers' value being more than running backs is that wide receivers get injured a lot more than running backs. So whereas if a running back gets injured, so say for example Christian McCaffrey, #1 pick last year, got injured and Mike Davis took a lot of his carries. If you picked up Mike Davis on waivers, you got a lot of opportunities. But generally, wide receivers don't get hurt as much. So if you are in a position where you don't have good wide receivers early, it's generally harder to replace that as the season goes along because, again, the guys that you're getting later on are competing for touches with some other players, and unless there's a whole slew of injuries and they really break out, it's very difficult to find a receiver that you can plug in as a dominant option for you on your team as the season progresses. And then the other thing, too, is that it's not a direct handcuff situation generally with wide receivers because when an elite wide receiver gets hurt, more than often, instead of just going to the next man up only, they have to split it between multiple players. So you don't have that direct Mike Davis, Christian McCaffrey type situation like I described earlier with wide receivers. So that is conceptually why it makes sense to take a wide receiver early. But we take a look at the stats here, and they justify this as well. So as I've been doing in my previous videos, I go through stats over the past 3 years, and I will do that as well with the wide receivers. So for wide receiver analysis, I want to highlight that there are a lot of outliers for wide receivers that stand out. There's only generally a few each year, though. So, and then after that, it's relatively consistent production and not a lot of stratification as you go down the list of performance per season. So we go back to 2018. The top 15 wide receivers, and I will also take a look at the next 35 wide receivers in terms of how they performed on the season. This is for PPR leagues, just for your awareness. So for the top 15 wide receivers in 2018, they varied from a total of 330 points to 230 points. So that's a difference of 100 points right there. Then you go to the next 35 wide receivers, though, and they varied from a total of 230 to 128 points. So 102 points right there. There's going to be a method that I'm going to explain to this. For 2019, the top 15 wide receivers varied between a score of 368 points and 218 points. So a total of 150 points difference between the top 15 wide receivers. For the next 35, however, there was a difference in 217 points, and then the number 50 receiver had 128 points. So a total of 89 difference between the next 35. Between the top 15 wide receivers last year in 2020, the number 1 wide receiver had 354 points. The 15 wide receiver had 232 points. And then for the next 35, the number 16 had 226, and the number 50 player had 146. So that's a difference of 122 for the top 15 versus a difference of 80 for the top 30 for the next 35 up to the top 50. And some of these numbers are even further stratified when you consider in 2019, Michael Thomas was a significant outlier that season, and he scored almost 90 more points than the next receiver. Then there were some other ones that stood out as well. Chris Godwin, Julio Jones, that also put up a lot of points. And then in 2020, again, Devontae Adams stood out, Stephon Diggs stood out, and Tyreek Hill all stood out with over 300 points. And then it started dropping off more from there. So the key takeaway that I want to create with illustrating this data is that there are wide receivers there's a couple outliers, and then after that, it's relatively similar production. So, and I know that there is a little bit of difference there, but there's the fact that there is more variation among the top 15 than there is among the next 35, so up to top 50, tells you that if you're drafting receivers in the middle of drafts, for example, there is a strong possibility that they could perform relatively the same as somebody that you're getting off of waivers, be it because of inconsistent performances, other guys stepping up, etc. But there's generally only a few receivers that completely dominate per year. And you look at the production as well. It's a little difficult to break down each specific year in terms of how each player did and all that, so I'm not going to go into that as much as just to say that there's a whole slew of reasons between the number 16 and number 50 receiver in each of the last 3 years of why they performed where they did. But a lot of it is because of general inconsistent situations that popped up. So say they had a great stretch for a certain amount of time, then a quarterback got injured and they didn't play as well. Or, they got injured themselves. Or generally some games they only had one catch for 5 yards, for example. And because of that, you get a whole stratification of ranges of guys that played inconsistently. Whereas if you look for the most part at the players that scored in the top 15, they were all generally very consistent throughout the year. So all that being said, this is typically what people think of in terms of running backs' performances when they pick running backs that high, because in most people's minds, there's only a few running backs that really are consistent, and then after that, it's a whole slew of guys that are difficult to rely upon. So because of that, you need to prioritize running backs. But if you look at the statistics of wide receivers, the trend of that same mindset for running backs is actually true for wide receivers. There's only a few consistent wide receivers that you can generally rely upon that to be consistent. And to me, it shows you that if you lock up those guys, it gives you so much value than having to sift through players, having to constantly decide, well, which wide receiver 2 should I pick because I'm picking between guys that, they have a 20-point week one week and the next week they have 0. You avoid that whole headache when you can just lock in 2 guys. So, and as I mentioned with injuries, you can kind of cover yourself with running backs in that sense if you do your homework and stock your running backs, as I mentioned in the running back video. But it's difficult to do that for wide receivers. So how do you set yourself up in a position that you get good wide receivers? So as I talked about a little bit in my running back video, the first thing I try to do with the pass catchers is make sure I at least get one elite pass catcher, preferably in the first 2 rounds if I can, unless there's an outstanding situation where you have some other option like another elite running back up there. But I would generally try to get I try to get a great pass catcher early, and I try to see if I can get my second pass catcher within the 3rd to 4th round, because those are the guys that generally fall into that range of the top 15 wide receivers that I can rely upon, rather than the guys in the 4th, 5th, 6th round that players will usually, some owners will generally start looking for wide receivers. So, but which wide receivers do you want? And the ones that I talk about, and I talk about this in my 7 strategies to win a fantasy football championship video, also in the description below. But you want to find guys that will be the focal points of their offense. These are guys that are going to get all the targets from that receiver, from that quarterback, generally because they don't have a lot of other great receivers or they just have amazing chemistry. The best example of this is Davante Adams, and he has consistently been at the top of fantasy football performances over the past 3 years. He was number 1 in 2020 and 2019, and I believe in 2018 he was number 2 to DeAndre Hopkins. But again, there's always stuff about how Adams is the only receiver that Rodgers had and whatnot, and this is why Aaron Rodgers is leaving Green Bay. But there's a reason behind why this makes Davante Adams an incredible wide receiving option for fantasy football, is because he's going to get all these targets from Aaron Rodgers. Other guys that have been like this in the past and will probably be like that moving forward, DeAndre Hopkins, who's still doing that in Arizona, but especially in Houston, it was especially this way where he was Deshaun Watson's guy. Other ones, Tyreek Hill, focal point of the Chiefs' offense. You got Justin Jefferson and Adam Thielen are the 2 elite wide receivers there. So you try to find guys that are going to dominate the touches for their team, as opposed to other situations such as Tampa Bay, which I generally do not like. I'm generally not looking into Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, Antonio Brown, because I could just see a situation where any of those 3 players could have a good game from time to time, but then just fall off a cliff the next game, because that's generally how Tom Brady offenses go. So yeah, the next thing that I look for when I'm trying to pick a wide receiver is I try to pick guys that have value over and potential for a lot of future performance, as opposed to guys that are just give you modest gains. So an example of this is on the Dallas Cowboys. They have generally their wide receiver core, the top three guys they have are Amari Cooper, CeeDee Lamb, and Michael Gallup. And a lot of people are torn between Amari Cooper and CeeDee Lamb. But for me personally, I would take CeeDee Lamb over Amari Cooper easily because one, Amari Cooper is inconsistent, which I'm going to talk about in a sec. But CeeDee Lamb has so much potential moving forward as an elite wide receiver. And it's just generally better if you're actually shooting for winning a championship and trying to take advantage of guys that will really help your offense explode, is to take guys that have a lot of potential to bust out. Other guys like this, Amon-Ra St. Brown, I'm going to talk about a little more later, but he is a guy that has a lot of opportunity in Detroit because they don't really have a lot of great wide receivers there. Other players, Michael Pittman is one that stands out to me. Indianapolis has got some injury issues with T.Y. Hilton and just lack of other receivers across the board. So, yeah. Then the next thing that I look at in terms of wide receivers, in terms of key things that I'm looking for when picking a wide receiver, is trying to make sure that I'm getting good value relative to their average draft position. So what I mean by this is that there's going to be some wide receivers that are selected extremely high in drafts and are going to create a lot of a bust potential, in my opinion. So I would personally try to target guys, especially if they're later on, that have more value. I talked about Amon-Ra St. Brown earlier. I think he is an example of somebody who's got excellent value relative to his draft position, as somebody that's generally going at the very end of drafts to maybe even undrafted in some leagues. Other guys like this are Marquez Callaway from New Orleans, got a lot of chemistry so far with Jameis Winston. Other players that are extremely valuable, in my opinion, are Russell Gage as the second wide receiver in Atlanta. He's very much being slept on. So a good example is somebody like Russell Gage versus Kyle Pitts. I know he's a tight end, and we're talking wide receivers here. But in general, that's a guy that's being extremely hyped, in my opinion, as the next pass-catching option. So if you were to find an equivalent situation of a wide receiver who's being overhyped as opposed to somebody who's generally going later in draft boards, it's better to take somebody later on who has more potential upside relative to their average draft position. Good example of situations to avoid are the Cincinnati Bengals. They have Tyler Boyd, T. Higgins, and Jamar Chase all going relatively high on draft boards, but I just have a very hard time seeing that actually working out because, one, they've got a split between all three receivers. Again, focal point of offense, they don't really have that Cincinnati. Another thing is that Cincinnati's offense has not really shown to be particularly effective so far with Zach Taylor. They also have to play Pittsburgh twice a year, Baltimore twice a year. I just don't see those receivers working out relative to how high they're being taken. But if you were to take any of them, based on one of my earlier points I mentioned, Jamar Chase would be the guy because of the, again, potential for upside. Then the last thing that I look at in terms of when I pick a wide receiver is trying to get guys that have high consistency, as opposed to players that are more up and down. So I talked about Amari Cooper earlier, and I am a continual advocate for not taking Amari Cooper because he is the definition of somebody that will, one game he'll go off for 5 catches, 200 yards, 2 touchdowns. And people will talk about him like he's the second coming of Jerry Rice. But then the next game, he will have 1 catch for 2 yards. And it's just a constant up and down. Other guys like this are Sammy Watkins. Other players of note, Mike Williams is like this. There's other wide receivers as well that kind of fall into this trap too. So some other ones that come to mind are Jerry Jeudy, Henry Ruggs, things like that. But I can't really fault them so far because they're both second-year players. But you have guys like that are very up and down from game to game. And I generally try to avoid players like that because you don't want to chance yourself in a situation where they have one of those bad weeks, because that's going to be the difference between you winning and losing your week. So guys that are going to get more consistent targets, like Allen Robinson, who is generally catching a lot of passes every game, getting a lot of targets, and even guys like Cole Beasley that you can get late from the Bills are excellent value because they're PPR machines that are constantly getting catches. May not necessarily be explosive plays, but they will give you more consistent value that's more easily to rely upon. So those are generally the 5 things that I look for in terms of wide receivers. So I'm running a little short on time in this video, so I'm not going to get to it in this one, but there are a whole wide range of wide receivers to consider, and I talk about different ones at different point in time. So if you want to find out specific information on individual wide receivers, comment below and I will give you my opinion on them. I was thinking about possibly going through the whole ADP list of wide receivers, but that would take very long. But if you got questions on individual receivers, let me know. Also, if you check out my mock draft videos, I do talk about the receivers I do like and take some of those as flyers later on. So if you are interested in what I think of particular receivers, you can check out some of my mock draft videos as well if you don't get your questions answered. But let me know what you think of this video. Let me know what wide receivers you like and don't like and whatnot. And if you got any questions, comment below and I will answer you and give you a shout out as well. So thank you for watching. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.